Good afternoon. On behalf of the Carter Center and the Universal Rights Group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Forum on Human Rights and today's roundtable discussion on risks to human rights and credible elections during an online infodemic. My name is Avery Davis Roberts, and I'm an Associate Director in the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. I am very excited for today's conversation. We have a fantastic panel of experts on issues related to human rights, misinformation, journalism, and elections, and it's going to be great. For the Carter Center, the subject of this panel falls right at the intersection of several areas of our programming. We are, first and foremost, a human rights organization. Human rights imbues all aspects of our work at the Carter Center, from our health-related programming to our election observation efforts. In fact, Carter Center election observation and support is firmly rooted in a rights-based approach to assessment. International human rights law is the basis for the criteria we use to evaluate elections around the world. The Human Rights and Election Standards Plan of Action, published by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Carter Center, calls on human rights and election experts and actors to come together more regularly and more strategically to address challenging issues that face both communities. The far-reaching effects of misinformation and disinformation must surely be on the short list of the most significant challenges we face in our societies, not least because it exacerbates and aggravates the many other challenges that we're already facing. The Carter Center, through our Digital Threats to Democracy project, joins others in a global community who are trying to understand, measure, and mitigate the potential harms of misinformation to human rights and to our election processes, and this conversation is a part of that effort. With this, I'd like to turn over to my colleague, Danica Damplow of the Universal Rights Group, for some opening remarks. Danica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Avery. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. It is truly a privilege to be a part of this group. As Avery said, we're very excited about these phenomenal panelists we have today and a truly interesting and perhaps the most relevant discussion imaginable. My name is Danica Damplow, and I am the head of the New York office of Universal Rights Group. Universal Rights Group is a think tank that focuses on accelerating progress on human rights issues through policy-based research, analysis, diplomacy, and dialogue. We have embarked on 2 new projects on democracy, one intersecting with digital technology, and the other looking at human rights standards in elections. So this is very much part of our work and our efforts, along with the Carter Center, to really pull the fields of human rights and elections and democracy together. So I want to begin by thanking the Carter Center, and in particular Avery, for co-organizing this event today, and to thank our esteemed panelists for taking the time to join us. To set the scene, I'll start by noting that when it comes to whether disinformation and digital technology can have a potentially negative effect on democracy and human rights, it's no longer a hypothetical question. For example, earlier this year, the head of the World Health Organization coined the term infodemic to describe the proliferation of misinformation around COVID-19. This misinformation would ultimately undermine public health guidelines and fuel the spread of the deadly pandemic. We've also seen infodemics pop up around elections, with the proliferation of often contradictory information about candidates, voting, and other related issues. We've seen in the United States how domestic and foreign actors have used social media platforms to send targeted disinformation to different voter groups. And when you have false and manipulated information, it can undermine credible elections, particularly when it erodes public trust in democratic norms and practices. Now, we will today end up talking more about the US election than perhaps Avery and I had originally envisioned when we were putting this together. It is clearly a relevant and perhaps inescapable case study, but we also do want to make the point that this is a global concern. It has ramifications outside the US and for elections all over the world. Just 2 weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, world leaders from every region cited democracy and digital technology as 2 of their key priorities. And over 24 different world leaders cited the spread of misinformation as a serious challenge to governance, COVID-19 recovery, and the exercise of civil and political rights. Democracy and credible elections can bolster the promotion and protection of human rights. And by the same token, truly credible elections can only happen in environments in which human rights are respected. These include rights such as freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, the right to information, freedom from discrimination, and many more. And we have seen how social media platforms can give space for the exercise of these rights. But we have also seen how these social media platforms can be used to violate these rights, becoming pathways for voter suppression and hate speech. Governments will need to take this more seriously. So too do social media companies. It will be critical, as Avery said, for those of us in the human rights, democracy, elections, tech, media fields, in collaboration with social media companies, tech companies, government actors, and more, to develop workable solutions that recognize the importance of freedom of expression while also responding to the serious challenge posed to democracy and human rights by disinformation and hate speech. So I'm going to give it back to Avery because I'm also very excited to hear what all our panelists have to say today.
Thank you, Danica. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists, an incredibly accomplished group. In fact, so accomplished that if I were to read through their complete bios, we wouldn't have much time left for discussion. So I'm going to try and keep it very brief so that we have plenty of time left for our conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Dominique Day. Dominique is the chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, a fact-finding body mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate and report on the situation of people of African descent globally. She is a human rights attorney who also leads Daylight. We're so glad to have you with us today, Dominique. I'd also like to introduce Kate Jones. Kate is an academic researcher focusing on cyber and human rights law issues. She is Associate Fellow of Chatham House and author of Chatham House's research paper on online disinformation and political discourse, applying a human rights framework that came out in 2019. Kate is based at the University of Oxford, where she is a member of the law faculty and associate of the Oxford Human Rights Hub and teaches public international law. Welcome, Kate. We also have with us today Irene Khan. Irene Khan is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, newly in this mandate since August 1st, 2020, and she is the first woman to hold this position since the establishment of the mandate in 1993. An internationally recognized advocate for human rights, gender equality, and social justice. She teaches at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and she has also served as the Secretary General of Amnesty International and has headed the International Development Law Organization. Welcome, Irene. And last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Amy Mitchell. Amy Mitchell is the Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center. She is responsible for the center's research related to news and information, including how the public accesses and engages with and creates news, what news organizations are providing, and how technology is challenging all of these elements. So glad you're here, Amy. So before we jump into the conversation, I just want to make a quick note for the audience that we hope that you will participate and join in as well. You can do so at any time by joining the live chat and submitting questions for the panelists. Don't feel that you have to wait till the end of the conversation to submit your questions. We would like to hear from you throughout. In order to participate in the live chat, you must be a member of the Forum on Human Rights, and you can join by clicking into the chat box to the right of this video feed. I don't know which way I'm pointing, but I want to point one way or the other. You can click into that chat box to the right of this video feed, or by clicking Join the Community at the top right corner of your browser. So I think we can now jump in. And my first question is for you, Amy. The media plays several crucial roles in election processes. They provide information about the electoral process itself, like the mechanics of voting. They report on the ideas and actions of electoral contestants, and they can serve as sort of a watchdog, helping to ensure transparency. Based on your research of journalism and the media in the US, how would you say these roles have changed in the context of social media and political polarization?
Thanks, Avery, and thank you to the Center for holding this forum and for letting me and Pew Research Center be a part of the conversation. You know, I'd say certainly the fundamental role of the press still stands, that fundamental role of reporting reporting things out, serving as a watchdog. But overall, there have also been a lot of challenges to it, a lot of additions to the landscape, as well as divides in the views about the news media across the population. We look at a few of the different, data points. We see that about 3/4 of Americans still say it's important for journalists to serve as watchdogs over elected leaders. So there's still pretty strong support, and for that basic fundamental role that they play. But when we asked in a follow-up about how journalists are performing that role today, U.S. adults are much more divided. You have about 35% that say they're going too far in that role, 32% that say they're not going far enough, and the remaining 30% or so saying they get it about right. And when we dig further into those data, one of the areas of big divide there is partisanship, with Republicans much more likely to say they're going too far, in particular, than our Democrats. And that speaks to one of the other big challenges today when it comes to views, attitudes, and the accepted role of the news media, which is the degree to which political polarization has really seeped in to both where people are turning for their news sources, for their news and information, as well as their attitudes about the news itself. So for example, there's a long-standing watchdog role question that we've asked sort of over, back in Reagan's presidential time. And when we asked it following the 2016 election, so in general, we had seen pretty strong support for it across the board, with some differences based on which party was in power. But we got, after the 2016 election, we suddenly had a 42 percentage point divide between Republicans and Democrats in their sense of that role, just dramatically widened. The widest gap before had been 20 points. So, really strong divides. And then we saw that cut across a number of different measurements about the news media generally in terms of the attitudes and the trust in the news media. And since 2016, we've basically just seen those divides continue to grow, with Republicans overall becoming more critical of the news media, Democrats becoming more positive about the news media generally. But they've also really separated in the sources that they're turning to. And so there's a lot more separation in how, and to a certain degree, the actual information Americans are getting based on the places that they turn for their news. And finally, the other thing I'd mentioned that's come into the landscape more are these non-traditional types of providers of news. And if we think about, just even the coronavirus pandemic, you have everything from President Trump in the White House as things that people rely on a lot, or say they're the main place they turn for news, to the CDC, to your state elected leaders, et cetera. So there are a lot of other places that Americans are also turning to for their news and information, in addition to the more traditional news media.
Thanks, Amy. That was a really sort of helpful overview. And I think this issue of polarization and how it's seeped into the consumption of news, we see it seeping into other aspects of our daily lives, including, sort of the nuts and bolts of how people perceive the administration of elections, which is something that we've been thinking about a lot at the Carter Center. But I think this issue of polarization and the way it seeps in and it sort of creates a ground that's very fertile for misinformation, I think, is a really important point, and I think a good starting place for this conversation. So thank you for that. Irene, if I could turn to you now. So this is a little bit of a shift, but exercising the right to freedom of expression and opinion is part of the electoral process in democracies. We know that, that's a sort of essential component, but it can also lead to the intentional or unintentional dissemination of disinformation. Can you sort of speak to the challenges of that balance of sort of preserving the essential freedom of speech while also combating disinformation and sort of protecting the rights of those who are on the receiving end?
Yes, it is a very interesting challenge because, as you know, freedom of expression is not limited to any particular type of expression, any particular type of views. It allows information and ideas that may shock or offend or disturb people. So it's a very broad right, and it's an extremely important right because it affects a whole range of other rights, from right to health, as we have seen in the context of COVID-19, or the right to political participation, as we are talking now. It's an individual's right, but it's also the right of society to receive information, to be able to share it, to be well informed. But what we have seen is that technology has transformed this freedom of expression in many ways, making it much easier for ideas to spread across borders and for people not just to receive information, but to participate in debate. Now, the downside, of course, of that is disinformation, as you mentioned. But how does one control disinformation? Disinformation is very hard to define. And one person's disinformation may be another person's point of view. And so controlling that becomes difficult and damaging. And at the end of the day, what we're really talking about in the electoral process is public trust, maintaining public trust and confidence. That's what inflow does. And if you lose that trust by restricting criticism or by allowing false information to flourish, then you're in trouble. So it's a question of actually looking at it from 2 points of view. And it's very important, I think, in looking at it to recognize that freedom of expression is not an absolute right. There are very clear grounds in international law, for example, public health, public order, protecting the rights of others, protecting reputation. These are grounds on which you can restrict freedom of expression. But the fight for disinformation is not actually a call to suppress pluralism, different types of views. We need to be very careful about that. It's actually a fight for facts. And in the political domain, as opposed to the scientific domain of health, it's very difficult to know what is fact, what is view, and what is in fact manipulation of information. And that's why one needs to look at actually both experience and research has shown that the best way of fighting disinformation is by upholding freedom of expression. Now, at first sight, that might seem strange, but that's the way to do it, so that disinformation doesn't undermine or erode freedom of expression. It actually allows access to information. It allows, for example, independent journalism to flourish so that people can get different views. And while there can be laws in certain areas, for example, such as hate speech, which leads to racial violence, or there can be self-regulation to some, largely that's what's happening, for example, with free media or with the social media platforms. There needs to be also a great deal of information out there. And there needs to be a multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional approach to addressing disinformation. I know we are going to focus on talking about social media platforms, but really there isn't one single answer to this. We need to recognize that people receive information and share information in many different ways, even in this digital age. And therefore there is a space for governments, and governments must allow information to flourish. Freedom of expression must be respected. So for example, a blank shutting down of internet is not an answer to dealing with disinformation. Criminalizing certain forms of criticism of government is not allowed either, because that's the other side of the coin, that there will be many authoritarian governments, certainly, but also in some cases even democratic governments that are seeking to shut down free speech. That's not the answer either. So one needs multiple ways of approaching this and empowering citizens. What's actually been shown is that if you empower citizens with information, including through a free and independent effective journalism, that's also a way of fighting disinformation.
Thank you. I mean, that was a very good overview of the sort of the challenges of finding that balance, and the way that you have to. It's not just a balance on sort of two ends of like a seesaw. It's a balance of sort of multi-point balancing process to make sure that rights are fulfilled and protected on all fronts. Dominique, I have a question for you. Could you tell us a little bit about how the working group of experts on people of African descent, how the work of that group intersects with these other areas of freedom of expression, freedom of information, and political participation?
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for this important conversation, I think, at this moment in time. So our working group investigates the situation of anti-Black racism globally. We look at peoples of African descent access to their human rights, and we look at the ways in which these stories of denials of access to human rights have a lot of commonality country to country, and the basis for that, right, being very much in the origin of our modern global system, our modern global economy. When we look at the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans, when we look at colonization, those networks have actually birthed a lot of our modern world today. And so our work really involves doing a deep dive into how anti-Black racism looks and how that impacts human rights. And I think this idea of infodemic is really key to that. We've just put out a report, for example, on it's called COVID-19 Systemic Racism Global Protest, looking at the intersections in which how people of African descent remain a primary risk group for contracting COVID-19, for being severely impacted by it, and yet have also faced disproportionate violence from the police, from the state, and disproportionate lack of social protection from the state, despite the enhanced risk. And so when we're talking about things like infodemic and the intersection of human rights violations, we see often people of African descent lie squarely at these intersections. And so to us, the strength of looking at human rights with this very active inquiry for race has to do with this opportunity to reconcile our current and our historical hypocrisies and these inconsistencies between our values and our actions, using our history, using justifications for the greatest global atrocities we've ever known as key data points. And so in the space of freedom of expression, we actually have some really fascinating data points right there, right? Over the summer, a lot of people were talking about Juneteenth, a holiday where African Americans in June have a lot of ice cream to celebrate the awareness of the Emancipation Proclamation signed 2.5 years earlier. Even the information of our freedom, according to the political entity to which we had been trafficked, was denied people of African descent systematically, even in the course of renegotiating our status, right? And so the space in which freedom of information, freedom of expression, political participation has our core criteria of liberty, that's always been hedged with respect to people of African descent. Our narratives of democracy, of republic, have always existed in this country, and not just in this country, have always existed in parallel to atrocity, to blatant violations of this idea of liberalism. And that's the space that we investigate in order to really uplift the ongoing inconsistencies, the comfort and the willingness to exploit African land, bodies, resources, intellect, absolutely informs the wealth of some of the countries that see themselves as leaders in human rights. And without actually amplifying that dichotomy, it's really hard to get to the truth of what drives our challenges in committing to human rights.
Thank you, Dominique. That was a very sort of helpful overview of the work of the working group. And we're going to be coming back to sort of dig a little deeper on some of these questions more specifically related to race, elections, misinformation, using some concrete examples later. So I'm looking forward to picking that up with you. Kate, could you give us some key takeaways of your report on online disinformation and political discourse, applying a human rights framework, just to give the full title, and sort of one thing maybe that surprised you in your work and in that research?
Yes, thank you, Avery, and thank you for this important discussion this afternoon. Well, in my report, the first thing I looked at was the factual nexus. And as you know, political campaigning is about persuasion. And if we think back to electoral campaigns 20 years ago, the dominant medium was TV. There was also campaigning, of course, in other media. There were in-person rallies and campaigning, and perhaps you had leaflets through your mailbox. So persuasion was done by political campaigners to us, the voters. It was done publicly, and the same persuasion was offered to everyone in the same constituency. If you think about campaigning today, it's massively different, but the rules of the game haven't kept up. So now you are bombarded by persuasion every time you pick up your phone. It's in your notifications, it's in your scrolling feed. Persuasion isn't just coming from campaigners. It isn't necessarily the same for everyone because it can be tailored to you according to what is known about you. And it isn't all public because what you see may be different from what your next door neighbors see, and there's no way of knowing what the differences are. So persuasion in politics has learnt lessons from the advertising industry about what is effective as persuasion, and what matters isn't so much accuracy, but whether something grabs you visually, whether it makes you respond emotionally, particularly whether it's sensational, particularly if it arouses negative emotions such as disgust and outrage, whether it has a really strong, clear narrative, and how much it is repeated. And we see these techniques now being rife in politics. As I say, you see them every time probably you look at your phone. And our cognitive biases are being exploited essentially by two types of actor. One, foreign actors, such as the IRA, well covered in 2016, so foreign interference with elections. And secondly, now increasingly, by domestic political campaigners in lots of different countries, who all, of course, are seeking to win elections. And the problem is that nobody knows what the rules of the game are. Nobody knows what is an acceptable campaigning technique and what's not, because those rules just haven't been clear. We're much more aware than we were in 2016 of the kind of techniques being used, but we don't know, we haven't clarified as society what's acceptable and what's not. And that means there's a risk of seeing a race to the bottom all around the world. So in thinking about responses, I think human rights law has to be the guiding framework. And in terms of the surprise in my research, it's really how slow states have been to adopt human rights law as the guiding framework. The special rapporteur, Dr. Khan, has set out really clearly the importance of freedom of expression in this context. And of course, it's absolutely vital. But there are other rights that are really important too, including the right to vote and participate in public affairs. And one of the things that guarantees is that groups or individuals should not be disincentivized from voting. They should not be manipulated so as not to want to vote. Privacy, and then freedom of thought and freedom of opinion. And I'd like to highlight freedom of thought and opinion because they're rights that we've taken for granted, that the space inside your head is private, that you can think what you like, and you can form your own opinions. And the difficulty is now that in the political context and elsewhere with surveillance capitalism, we see breaches, the illegitimate harvesting of our personal profiles, forming of pictures about us, and then this invisible shaping of our opinions. And so in my view, we need to be thinking about what the limits ought to be on those techniques. And it is possible to set limits on campaigning techniques without violating the right of freedom of expression, because it's not about people being able to say what they want, but it's about how that is amplified and used to manipulate people. And I think that's the area that we ought to be thinking about. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. That's very helpful. And I think it's a nice segue actually into a question I have for Dominique, sort of picking up on some of your points, Kate, and maybe asking Dominique to go a little bit deeper on some of the points that she was raising. So, as I think many of us know, hopefully all of us know at this point, the U.S. has sort of long struggled with both structural racial discrimination directly linked to voter suppression, and also sort of more generalized race-based discrimination through hate speech and other forms of violence and violations of our bodies or otherwise, all of which continue to have implications for political participation, definitely have clear implications for the upcoming elections. A more recent example of this came from a report by the UK's Channel 4 News, which obtained a huge data leak from the 2016 Trump campaign. And the leak revealed that the personal data of almost 200 million voters, that data was manipulated, algorithms were manipulated to deter millions of Black Americans from voting. Sort of based on your work with the working group, what do you think we can be doing to combat this, Dominique? And do you have other reflections on some of the points that Kate was just raising about, sort of persuasion and the clear rules that we need now because of the way that we're able to micro-target on the basis of all kinds of characteristics?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this question, and also Kate's earlier comments. I think, I actually think there's some work for us to do in how we conceptualize these things, how we understand how all of these are connected, how we understand how our taxonomy, how the way we classify things can normalize atrocity. When we talk about electoral campaigns, right? I think a lot of us here in the US know that I think the Trump campaign began its 2020 campaign the day after the inauguration, which allowed all sorts of language, advertisements, and conduct that would have been inappropriate for within the context of state speech or presidential speech. And on some level, those of us who understand systems say, oh, well, okay, this is within the campaign. So is it really okay for a sitting president and public servants who've sworn to uphold the Constitution to then engage in campaign tactics seeking to deter the vote of 13% of the population? Is that really okay? Our taxonomy, which separates out corporate behavior, campaign behavior versus government behavior, has normalized that for us, has given us a framework to that habituates us to this deeply problematic, deeply anti-democratic, deeply oppressive practice. And yet we don't find ourselves, right, like this taxonomy has habituated us, we don't find ourselves questioning it. We hear it, we shake our heads, we say another ridiculous thing. And so I think that question of how the rationalization and exclusion, particularly for people of African descent, right, that's my focus, but this does have implications for democracy more broadly. How much of that has to do with the concentration of power and privilege, and how many avenues we've actually created in our society, specifically when it comes to things like elections and corporations, right? Like there are areas in which we've really think about the exploitation of opportunity as kind of, we give it a wink and a smile to the exploitation of people, to the exploitation of my civil and political rights in that process. This isn't new, right? We saw literacy taxes, poll taxes, the Jim Crow South, the Voting Rights Act being eviscerated. The idea that we see this kind of deterrence practice, which again, not limited to the US, we saw this in Guyana in a previous election, where the idea of one campaign was to deter the Black vote and pull out the South Asian vote, right? And these tactics are deeply destructive to ideas of community, to the ideas of unity, right? But at the same time, these aren't new, and on some level they are licensed by the hostility to the idea of racism within our elite institutions that we've also become habituated to through the social conditioning. So I think we have to interrogate our assumptions and our conclusions. For a lot of Americans and for a lot of people around the world, I wouldn't even say Americans are the worst offenders here. The idea of racism is white noise, right? They don't necessarily see it because it doesn't necessarily impact them. When I walk into court and a judge mistakes me, although I'm wearing a suit, carrying a computer, talking a lot, as a criminal defendant, right? And my colleagues don't even notice, don't hear it, rationalize it, make an assumption about that somehow all indicia of who I am become subservient to my skin color. Like these spaces are evidence of a bigger problem, how much the sort of the everyday racism that normalizes this kind of massive problem, right? Deterring the Black vote is crazy, and yet very normalized in the American context. This kind of rendering of racism to white noise creates a space where it's actually very difficult to even have these conversations, to interrogate our own conclusions and assumptions. And ultimately, segregation alone has separated people's self-interest from the impacts of systemic racism. So we need to talk about racism as racism. We need to ultimately do a little work on our conceptual frameworks, because our conversations have really relegated racism to tiki torches and Klan hoods, instead of the everyday conversations that allow a lot of people to retain and concentrate power and privilege. And that softly, and sort of death by a thousand cuts, keeps certain communities separate from the same opportunity. And that space starts with looking at our taxonomy, looking at the very way we classify information, the very way we classify appropriate versus inappropriate, has always licensed and facilitated racism in the US and also outside, and certainly inside of elections.
Thanks, Dominique. I think that's a really interesting point, and I think something I will definitely be pondering more as I think about our own work at the Carter Center and how we talk about elections. I think that there is, you do end up using a sort of a common taxonomy because it's convenient, because it's easy for people to understand, and so finding ways to sort of re-examine that from a sort of race perspective, from a gender perspective, I think is something that we all need to do, and I know something that we're constantly trying to think about at the Carter Center. So that's a very helpful sort of reminder to me to take this forward in our own conversations and internally, as well as externally. Changing course just slightly, Amy, based on your research, how does the media diet of the average American appear to impact not only their opinions of candidates, but the elections themselves and sort of media more broadly? Do you see the starkest difference between those consuming social media, those relying on regular news? And I actually have a question that I want to tie in from the audience, slightly related to this, which is sort of what would your recommendations be thinking about media for maybe young people to sort of be good consumers of media, or to keep themselves out of a fake news trap?
Sure, yeah, and I would, just following up on what Dominique was saying also, I mean, we've certainly seen in our data and our research in particular on the coronavirus pandemic, the really stark differences between Black Americans, white Americans, and others in both sort of the way they're following it, the types of, the range of topics that Black Americans in particular are paying very close attention to at the local level, especially, as well as at the national level. Their sense of the importance of it is, there's very wide differences there when you look at the breakdown by race. So it's really a different story and a different experience in many cases when you look at it by race and ethnicity. And then sort of to speak to your question, there are so many differences based on media diet. So one of the things that we've been doing this year is a project called the American News Pathways Project. And it's looking at specifically that question of how Americans sense what they see, what they hear, what they perceive and believe, think is true surrounding current events, primarily the election, the coronavirus crisis, and the protest. How those connect to and differ based on media diet. And so, while we certainly see partisan divides in a lot of cases, a lot of those divides, they differ within party as well based on media diet. So I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute with some examples, but social media. So we did also look particularly at people who are, who say that they, primarily rely on social media as opposed to another pathway, whether it's cable TV or network TV or print or one of these others, as a way of being informed, getting political news. And what we found is was pretty interesting, and this cut across sort of 9 different months of data collection, 5 different specific surveys that we did. And you find that overall, the folks, which is about 2 in 10 US adults who primarily rely on social media, they tend to be paying less attention to the news in general. So when you ask them about their attention levels to the election or to COVID or to some of these other things, they overall tend to be less engaged, following a number of these areas less closely. They also tend to be less knowledgeable. So we ask a range of sort of 29 different kind of, basic knowledge questions, some of which are political standard kind of political knowledge questions, and others that are more surrounding current events. And you see that social media, those who rely on social media, with people who rely on local TV as tending to be those that are the least knowledgeable in these areas. When we get into the question of misinformation, made up news, that sort of range of spectrum, the social media consumer group tend to be express less concern about the impact of made up news, but they often tend to have greater exposure in many cases. So for example, things like some of the unproven claims of treatment for the coronavirus, whether it's hydroxychloroquine or vitamin C, they've had greater exposure to. They also show greater belief. Those who have heard of the pandemic theory, sort of that idea of that the whole coronavirus crisis was planned by powerful people. Among those that have heard of it, people who primarily turn to social media tend to express more belief in that system itself. So there definitely seems to be some areas of impact that are greater in that group. But one of the other things that's happening, and we've seen this quite dramatically across a number of different things we asked about, everything from election-related things to coronavirus things, is differences based on specific media outlets that people are turning to. Both sort of, when you look at a range of what are considered more traditional outlets, we group people within party according to whether they go to only to outlets that have audiences that lean to the right politically, or they go to a mix, a different sort of mix of types of outlets. And then this would do the same among Democrats, of those who say that they only go to outlets or only rely to a large degree on outlets that have audiences that lean to the left politically. And when you look within party, you often see some very strong differences. And I'll just give one example of a recent question we asked about around the question of mail fraud. And this just sort of speaks to how, there's the range of everything from QAnon conspiracy theory to pandemic to claims about mail fraud to, claims about whether Joe Biden supports defunding the police. And some are these wholly made up things. Others are, takes on different types of, that have some basis in fact, or don't, but relate to current events. And what it leads to is this really strong sense of confusion and uncertainty among the American public, that they just don't know. So if we asked a question about mail fraud, and the degree to which there is voter fraud, tied to, is there evidence of increased voter fraud connected to mail ballots, which we know, through all the experts, that there is not evidence of significantly higher voter fraud. So among the American public overall, it's pretty divided. You have about a quarter who say that it's a major problem, another portion that say it's a minor problem, and then about another quarter that say it's not a problem at all, and sort of a mix that aren't sure. But when you look at it by the degree of where people are turning for their news, there are big partisan divide, with Republicans far more likely than Democrats to say that voter fraud is a major problem tied to mail-in ballots, which is like 43% of Republicans overall, compared to about 10% of Democrats. But when you look at those Republicans who only go to outlets for main sources of news that have right-leaning audiences to sort of align with them politically, that portion, that sense of voter fraud being a major problem, rises to 61%. So very strong differences when you look at it by party. There is, on the Democratic side, it's sort of the reverse, in that those who rely primarily on outlets with left-leaning audiences tend to be much more likely than the other group to say it's not a problem at all. So a different sense of just their knowledge and their perception of events. Then the other thing that happens that I was talking about earlier, these other types of sources that people turn to. And so if you look at that same question again, based on the degree to which people say that they Donald Trump at the White House are main sources of news for them, again, you see much higher levels among Republicans who rely strongly on Trump in the White House for news, to see that as a major problem. So there's this swirling different, rounds of information, and it's everything from the pathway you choose. And, and the difference in the media groups is that the social media group in particular is less engaged, but those media diet groups tend to be more engaged, right? The ones that go to primarily go to the outlets with the audiences that align with them politically. And so there's just a real different sense of what's happening in the world and in our country, you know, connected to where people are getting their information.
Thanks, Amy. That was a good, if slightly depressing overview of the impact of the different news sources and the pathways. And I was wondering, Kate, maybe if you could sort of speak to whether or not you have seen similar sort of patterns in other parts of the world. You know, we're obviously coming up to the US election. As Danica said, we're trying not to focus solely on the US election, even though it is pretty galvanizing for many of us. But maybe could you speak to the impacts of misinformation, disinformation, absorption of news, and the sort of media diet, maybe in the UK around the British elections, the referendum, anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think first, just following that, as you say, very depressing picture painted by Amy, I think there's great recognition of the absolutely vital role of an independent media in democracy, in providing accountability for those in governance. And in Europe at the moment, I think there are concerns about the health of that independent media, particularly given lots of people taking their news from social media and the other phenomena that Amy was talking about. And so there's a real push, it's partly a financial push as well, that a lot of media have lost a lot of revenue, both through COVID, but also because people frankly aren't paying for their media in the way that their newspapers and so on in the way that they used to. And I think that's another challenge for our democracies that really needs to be tackled. As far as the UK is concerned, well, I think clearly we have seen attempts at disinformation in the UK. It hasn't been so extensively researched as in the US, and in particular, the British government didn't investigate the extent to which or whether disinformation influenced the referendum in 2016. So we don't have an official narrative on that. But these topics are very much on people's minds in Europe. And with the new administration, the new European Commission, we're seeing a real drive on this, and disinformation, partly because of the COVID crisis, but generally becoming a really high priority of the administration. And that's quite exciting, I think. Later this autumn should see the release of the European Democracy Action Plan by the European Commission, which will have the aim of safeguarding European democracy from online threats. And I think on this, I mean, we've heard some really important points from Dominique about the racial issues that you're facing in the US. And you can see the power of social media in reinforcing social division. And what concerns me a bit in Europe is that we also have a history which could easily cause division again if it's exploited in order to create division between people. We've spent the years since the Second World War building bridges in Europe, and you can see the risks that those who wish to exploit social division use the troubled history we have in order to tear down those bridges and to create ever more social rift. And then you can see that around the world as well. And so I think it's really important that legislators are turning their minds to these issues in order to avoid that kind of risk in the future, quite frankly.
Thanks, Kate. Just a reminder to our audience, we have about 10 minutes left in this panel. So if you'd like to ask any questions of the panelists, please drop them into that chat box, and we will get them asked to our panelists. Sort of picking up on Kate's comments, Irene, could you maybe sort of speak to what you see as the role for international organizations. Kate was talking a lot about the European Commission, a sort of regional organization that's sort of thinking about these issues. But what do you see as the role for international organizations and activists as well, as we try and navigate the many challenges of these issues, find that balance that you were talking about earlier, to sort of come out the other side in a sort of multi-stakeholder response?
Thank you. Let me pick up one point that Kate made in her earlier comment about freedom of opinion. You know, my mandate is actually freedom of opinion and expression, and it's important to note that freedom of opinion is absolute. There is no restriction under international law on that, whereas freedom of expression has a number of restrictions which have to be applied very restrictively, but they do exist. And therefore, this point that Amy was saying about how people are watching a particular type of news or being driven down a particular path is actually critical in dealing with disinformation, because it kind of builds this channel down there. And as we look at what is happening and as we see these new frontiers that actually challenge human autonomy, then we need to look at it globally. And we talked about Europe largely, but you know that there are elections in small countries in West Africa that are being manipulated through digital means, through social media platforms. And in those countries, of course, democracy is very fragile. Civil society is weak. There are, in many countries, authoritarian trends. So it's a very dangerous scenario that we see here, much more dangerous than in the 20th century when authoritarian trends were becoming evident. And in that context, you know, national rules are less likely to be effective than global rules, international rules. Everyone has to sign up to certain standards. So it makes international law a very powerful means of determining the values and standards and principles and how we manage the system of states, but also non-state actors. And by non-state actors, of course, we think of the private sector companies, but we also need to think of groups of civil or not so civil types of associations that are coming into this debate. How do you control this across borders? The first issue has to be coming back to the state. I think it's very important that governments should stop peddling disinformation, and that there should be pressure. International organizations such as the United Nations or the European Union are places where groups of governments are coming together, and peer pressure has to be put on to bring them online on these international standards. And unfortunately, we don't see that kind of political will. Then, of course, you have companies, you have internet platforms that have the reach and resources that many governments in this world don't have. And it's very dangerous, of course, to leave it to the private sector, profit-driven entities to determine access to information or freedom of people's ability to express themselves. And therefore, I come back to this point about international organizations promoting new forms of cooperation. The UN Secretary General has launched a digital cooperation agenda, which I think is extremely useful because it's bringing together diverse groups. And then, of course, companies themselves are seeking in various ways to manage disinformation. But of course, one has to be very careful not to put responsibility that belongs to the state onto internet intermediaries, because you don't want to privatize censorship. That's another risk to democracy. So there has to be stronger transparency and accountability for companies that social platforms and others that are using ways of managing content. Things need to be open, and people, I think citizens, have to be empowered with information, with opportunity, with open due process ways of controlling content on these platforms. People, individual citizens, are are aware of information, but they're being manipulated. So one has to look at as you talked about the international sphere, about international law, but then come back to communities and how information is spread in communities, how people and citizens can be empowered.
Thank you, Irene. So in just our last few minutes together, I wanted to do maybe a quick lightning round, unexpected lightning round of questions to just ask each of the panelists just the first thing that comes to mind for them of the thing that they would hope that our audience would take away from this conversation. I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to go first, if you have a quick thought before we close.
I will, only because I realized I didn't answer the audience question that you posed.
Oh.
So I could sort of close with a thought on that, which, the question as a reminder was about sort of, recommendations for young people as they look to be informed. And, the center specifically does not issue recommendations. We put out data. What I can say is just in general, and this is not only to young people, but one of the things we see in the conversation that we've been having today is the importance of checking, is the importance of going to multiple places, the importance of checking facts, the importance of following up, of asking questions. And that certainly the landscape of news and information today puts much greater onus on the individual to take that action, to be somebody who is sorting through and figuring it out. We did another study a little while ago that was looking at sort of differences in populations based parts of the population in terms of, who was able to identify and separate factual statements from opinion statements. A lot of differences there based on your digital savviness, your attention and trust in the news, et cetera. But that ability to sort through, to parse through, and taking the time to do that, which also becomes incredibly, can be incredibly hard today when the pace of news and information is so fast and things are coming at you, especially in social media, second by second by second, to pause and be able to say, let me see what else I can find out about this. So that would sort of be probably my closing thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Dominique, I see you unmuting yourself.
I think one thing I would really point out from what we've said and just generally, and something we were saying before, is how easy it is to normalize the very thing we say we're fighting against. And I think it is a component of resiliency. And I think we've seen in all of our countries the incredible resiliency of communities and the ability to survive despite all sorts of challenges. I think the downside of that is that it does also give us the ability to normalize the very atrocities and injustices and human rights violations we say are wholly contrary to our values. And I guess this is a moment where, on the one hand, we've seen really unbelievably robust activism around not sitting with the discomfort of business as usual and exclusion as usual. On the other hand, we see these incredible politicization of tools and levers to disenfranchise and to leverage power against people. And I guess for us, I think what I would hope that people might take from this is this constant critical inquiry, where our very resiliency, our very ability to get up and go to work again the next morning, we can look at that and ask ourselves, what are we actually becoming habituated to in that process? How can we actually still go to work the next morning, but also demand a bit more from everybody around us?
Thank you, Dominique. That's a good point. Kate, were you ready?
By all means, and as you can see, night has fallen behind me here in the UK, so it must be time to wrap up. I think we need to ask ourselves what kind of society we want and whether the situation we have at the moment is actually what we want for the future, or whether we want to be going back to healthier democracies. And having done that, we need to think about whether there are manipulative techniques that we want to say, okay, these are not condoned, maybe these are even banned. whether that's, for example, the use of deep fakes in political material, or the use of large networks of bot accounts to flood debate, and so on. It's not about stymieing expression, which is freedom of expression is vital, but it's about controlling techniques. And we need to decide on those norms as a society and not just leave it to the tech companies. They've got a really important role to play, but it's not just them. They're not elected to be guardians of the public interest. And I think it's a really unfortunate situation where political campaigns are becoming a bit of a battle between the tech companies and campaigners, because that makes so ever more division and difficulty. So I think that's the conversation we need to be having as a society, and that's where we need to be focusing our efforts. And human rights law, including opinion and thought, including privacy and the right to vote, as well as expression, offer us really good normative basis for doing that.
Thank you, Kate. And Irene, your closing thought.
You won't be surprised to hear if I say, let's think global. The impact is going to be local, but we really need to think cross-border. What may work in one part of the world can be distorted in another part of the world. And so that is why global principles, global standards, international coordinated action needs to be prioritized. There's a tendency to think about what's happening, for example, in the US, but what's happening in the US is going to affect the whole world. And people who don't have the right to vote are going to be affected by elections in the US. What the internet has done has brought us very close. And we do need, I think, in this environment to resist the attack and erosion of human rights that have been well tested in the past century. And we need to ensure that there is global public opinion and global civil society backing human rights.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I just want to offer our most sincere and deepest thanks to all of our panelists for this really fascinating and just deeply interesting conversation. I really appreciated all of the different perspectives that you brought to these issues. And I just thank you. I'd also like to thank the Universal Rights Group and Danica in particular for her partnership on this event. It's been a real pleasure to work together on this. We plan to continue this conversation actually in a discussion thread on the Forum on Human Rights, and hope that you'll all join us as we try and think more about these issues, maybe offer some solutions. You can do that by going to forum.cartercenter.org/roundtables. And we look forward to continuing these conversations with you there. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.